Buonasera. There, okay, that's pretty good. Okay. No, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm pleased to be first in this historic building and have an audience that I think will appreciate what I'm trying to say about how an art exhibition can convey ideas of artistic influence and also changes in technique, all important. So, moving forward, a little bit of terminology here with the idea of the blockbuster, right? Rethinking the blockbuster. So what is a blockbuster exhibition? And I do say with a bit of curatorial envy, this is the Met about 2004, that your exhibition with Leonardo and Caravaggio, that's the skinny blue one, is not even the biggest show on at once, right? But a blockbuster exhibition are exhibitions that are a really big kind of show, right? They're exhibitions that have a special ambition or scale, a certain sense of excitement. The idea that these are works of art that are brought together for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And now it's sort of once in a generation or maybe once in a decade. But anyway, the idea is that's a really big deal. And these exhibitions have a sense of event about them, and you can raise more money and get lots more press if it really seems to be big and dramatic in a way that something more modest might not seem as gripping. And of course there are limits though, and this is what I have begun to think about when I became a museum curator in 2001. You've got a problem of space, right? There's only so much wall space you'd have in a museum or gallery. Works need to breathe. I mean, you can double hang things, you can salon style things, but at a certain point the works begin to blot each other out. There's also the problem, of course, of money, right? It costs money to bring things from places, and you know that if it costs about $40,000, say, to bring an old master painting from Europe, you better be pretty sure that you want to bring that very painting and not another one. Or maybe you can, rather than send something from Germany, maybe you can get it in New Jersey or Cleveland or someplace much cheaper. And that's something to think about because not even the Met can have limitless budgets. There's another problem, of course, and this may be the biggest problem, though it's rarely respected, which is the point about the stamina of visitors, right? A human body can only stand so long. You can only enjoy an exhibition up to a point. How many things can you see, right? I often think this is a sign of curatorial or institutional indulgence, right? This idea is, well, because we can borrow all these paintings, or we can do example after example, let's just do it. Let's be as complete as possible. But that, I think, is completely crazy because the human body cannot stand this. And I remember, and probably many of you here will remember well, the beautiful, ambitious Matisse retrospective at MoMA in 1992. It was a fantastic show. And I remember thinking, wow, that was really satisfying. I said, really enjoyed. Then I turned the corner. There was a whole other floor. I'd seen half of the show. And so my heart sank. And it was like, oh no. And I thought I'd been pacing myself well. I was meeting Matisse midway and learning a lot. It was a Frederick Henri, it was great. And I was really enjoying this dialogue with the artist, and I just ran out of energy. I looked up that exhibition catalog. Any guesses how many individual objects were in that show? Any guesses? 412. Exactly. Even Matisse's mother would have thought that was too much. And so that's another problem. I mean, you make a good case for an artist with a certain number of works, but going beyond that, you're not doing the artist any favors when you exhaust your audience. And there's a reason why Leonard Bernstein wrote 2 acts of West Side Story and not 6 acts, right? It was enough, right? You've got to figure out that maybe, in fact, you can tell too many stories, you can make too many points, you can use too many examples, you can really burden your visitor with taking in too much, absorbing too many points, and also pivoting too often, right? I mean, you learn so much when you compare one work to another to a third. But to compare it to 410 other works, I mean, that's often tough. And so I really thought that maybe, in this kind of case, that less could be more. So in my museum-going experience, I thought less is more, and this is something that I would like to think about when I would get the chance to do my own exhibition. Now, another thing, of course, is the polarity between exhibition and show. It's curious because in English we have they're synonyms, exhibition and show. Now, exhibition sounds a little didactic, pedagogical, right? Mechanical inventions in 1876 that show off the country's sort of prowess as inventions. But so exhibition can be kind of tough, but show, I mean, who doesn't like a show, right? Shows are fun. They're like parades or operas or plays or magic shows, right? They don't call them magic exhibitions, they're magic shows. And so I'm a big opera lover, and some of you know, and I was thinking, well, how come it's so exciting when you hear the overture being played at the opera and the lights go down? It's a real sense of occasion. Whereas an art exhibition, you can go through on your own pace, and there's no real sense of light going down. But maybe we can sort of play up the inherent drama in an exhibition, or find some which may have been neglected. And so many of the slides I'll show you are from the exhibition I curated in 2009, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice. And to play up the idea of drama, I had distinct light levels, some rooms darker than others, distinct wall colors, so you really knew you were going into a different set of objects and arguments and comparisons. And then for fun, because this is the room here, the red one, of course, the sort of bordello red, was all the female nudes, all the Venuses and Danais, and they all have red curtains in them. And so I thought, why not take advantage and actually make a real red curtain on the wall, so you're kind of peeking in, the voyeuristic aspect. So those are some of the kind of premises I have about, let's not just put on an exhibition, but let's put on a show. So then, if you think about big exhibitions, blockbusters, there tend to be two general kinds, right? There is the monographic show, the retrospective, the single artist, right? Like that gigantic Matisse show, that was a single artist. Now, the advantage of a single artist show is you can really follow the arc of someone's career, see that person's development. It's extremely useful, particularly with old master artists, when something doesn't quite make sense. You'll see a whole wall of works and that's got to be a different hand. That can't be the same artist. It's also very good for chronology. I'll be in an exhibition and I'll be in like room number 2, and I say, this is not an early period work. This must be in a later period, because it just doesn't fit its neighbors. So those are advantages. But the problem with a monographic show, I think, is you end up really often worrying about what are you missing, right? We're seeing one artist, but in isolation, and you have this sense like, well, what else was going on, or who are the other artists, who are the influences, who was in turn influenced. So that was a sort of liability of monographic shows. Now, the opposite kind of big exhibition you see in blockbusters all the time is what you might call the group show, where they have an entire school, painters in Renaissance Siena, or the Impressionists in the 1880s, and you could have 5, 10, 20, 30 artists, and that's great because you have a real sense of the context, what was going on, relations, the dialogues, and in a sense, those kind of exhibitions recreate the conversations about art or politics or social issues at a certain moment. Sometimes these shows, though, it may take on 10, 20, 30 years, a whole century, and that means you're telling lots of stories with many examples, but at that point, the individual artist's contribution becomes diluted. There's just so much going on, and it's kind of forest for the trees sort of problem. So I wanted to think, as I began to plan my own exhibition, is there a middle way? Can you have some of the advantages of the monographic show, but some of the contextual benefits of a kind of group show, of a larger exhibition, more artists? And that's where I hit upon this idea of looking at 3 artists who are in the same place at the same time. Not 10 artists, not 20, and not 1, but 3, and seeing what that could tell us about the extremely important developments. Really, it's really the first and second generations of oil on canvas painting, and what that happens in the 16th century. So that was my kind of middle way. Now, as planning this exhibition, I'm a Tintaretto specialist, and he's the artist that I am attached to very deeply, feel very devoted to him and his work. And this is Tintoretto World Headquarters. This is the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, which he decorated with huge oil on canvas paintings, 25-year period from 1564 to 1588. There are more than 50 large canvases in it. It's probably the most impressive or imposing religious cycle by a single artist intact anywhere in the world. And so this is a confraternity, kind of businessmen's religious club. I mean, imagine like combining the Rotary Club with the Ultra Guild or something, and that's what you get. And so you can't take this apart, though, and the biggest paintings are enormous. The biggest paintings are almost as big as, say, the floor of this room. So you can't take that apart. And another problem, of course, is when you remove something from its original context, you also lose something. That is another liability of exhibitions. This is Titian's Assunta, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. This is the largest painting on wooden panel in the world. It's 1518 when Titian paints it. It's his big breakthrough, and he astonishes people, not just in Venice, but down in Florence and Rome as well. But you see from this picture that the way that Titian's composition here with this kind of circle, which of course a heavenly ideal perfect symbol, that's the Virgin Mary going up there. That is precisely proportioned to the row of windows here, and then here are the apostles down below, which they reach up in astonishment as she is pulled up from them, and this is precisely proportioned with the lower set of windows, and indeed this painting is the focal point for the entire church. It's much later than the church, but Titian realized that given this enormous building, he could make a high altarpiece that would bring everything together. So this picture also too big to move. Even now, a painting that's no longer in its original context, and I'm talking here about the miracle of the slave, which is Tintoretto's breakthrough. It's 30 years after the Titian. This here is a secret Christian who goes to Venice to worship at the shrine of St. Mark's in Venice, and the man who the local feudal lord wants to punish him for his Christianity. He's a non-believer, and so they says, well, we're going to hit you with clubs, and the clubs break apart. We're going to stab out your eyes with stakes, and they shatter. And we're going to break your limbs with mallets, and they break right here. All the weapons are ineffectual because swooping in like Superman is St. Mark, who is coming to the rescue of this humble servant. This is a gigantic painting, significantly larger than that on the screen. It's bigger than the doors in the Accademia in Venice. It's where it's lived since it was removed from its original setting. This painting, you can only send it to an exhibition if you roll it up, right? And that you could maybe do that with Italy, but they're never going to roll up something of this importance, a canvas painting of this importance, and send it to a foreign country. So these are the kind of limitations that you have to work with, questions of transportation, logistics, money. But also something else is that there are different standards, of course. A medium-sized Tintoretto painting in Venice is no big deal, but you bring it to Boston, and suddenly it seems very, very large. And even if you lose something by taking works out of their original context, or in this case, an existing context, it's no longer in the building for which it was painted, you do get advantages, right, with an exhibition. You get advantages of lighting, of proximity. I mean, so many places, paintings high on the ceiling, or the church altar is far away. And of course, you get advantages of juxtapositions. You can get close up to things. You can rearrange. You can reshuffle the deck in an exhibition in a way you could never do in a sort of walking tour, even in a place as art-filled as Venice. Now, I was looking at these three artists, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, and I was trying to figure out, okay, where am I going to get my good examples? Because I first kind of had three mini retrospectives. I had kind of great Titians, great Tintorettos, and great Veroneses. But I realized there are points of contact that would be interesting. And so I began to refine my checklist, that is the list of works in the show. And I said, I could actually, these two are kind of similar versions of the same thing, or these two were done in the same year. And as I kept shuffling my deck, I was getting better and better comparisons. One other thing, though, is you need to be truthful in your advertising. You can't have a show of Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, and it's about one or two Titians, and the rest are Tintorettos and Veroneses. Titian's the big name. I mean, you go to an exhibition of Michelangelo, and his friends, and it's just friends. That's not so good. And so I needed to make sure I could get my Titians. But this is complicated because Titian is one painter who has never fallen out of fashion. He's been extremely, there's no one really like him in a sense, that unlike Caravaggio or Raphael or Rembrandt, who's had ups and downs, Titian has always been, perceived by aristocrats, kings, and rulers as popes as the best guy. And because of that, there are very few in Venice. And that means that the Venetians overvalue their own Titians. Okay? This is a handsome Titian right here of St. John the Baptist. The pose is clearly taken from classical statues like the Apollo Belvedere, but it's one of very few in the Accademia, and therefore they prize this a bit too much. If I were to ask this for this painting to send it to Boston. Oh, I don't know, it's a Titian, etc. But when I went to ask about a Tintoretto, which I think is a better painting, they're like, oh, we've got 25, no problem. And so part of it is to figure out where you would ask. So I knew early on I would not be able to borrow any Titians from Venice. It would be too hard. It'd be like pulling teeth. Instead, I would borrow my Titians from Washington and Edinburgh and Florence and other places, but just not Venice. Now, another question about this exhibition, if you're looking really, I mean, again, like with any kind of historical writing, a biography or a historical account of an event, where do you begin? Now, this is a painting by Bartolomeo Vivarini, who's, the Vivarini is a family of artists, painters, who come from Murano. They work in Venice, the same generation as the Bellini family. And this is an altarpiece we have at the MFA. The bottom is a replacement, and some of the frame has been regilded, but in essence, this is a completely intact 1485 polyptych. It's a multi-panel altarpiece with a beautiful sculpture of the Pietà in the middle, and it is, you can just imagine how this would have been with little candles in a provincial church. Because I thought, okay, we're talking about Tintoretto, Titian, let's push back, start a little bit earlier, right? 1485 is a few years before Titian's born, only 2 or 3, but this will really make clear what a revolution they do. And also, this is the kind of painting on wooden panel, or it's a bunch of individual panels in this complicated frame, that would be very hard to borrow. In this case, it's already in the museum in Boston. So I thought, okay. But then, as I were thinking further about this, I thought, that's really pushing it too early. The point is not so much, I mean, when Titian was a young man in, 1506, 7, 1510, he wasn't looking at stuff like this. I mean, this was so much earlier. It was archaic practically when it was painted. So why would a cutting-edge young artist necessarily think this is his starting point? He didn't. So I got rid of that idea. Now, the most fascinating artist, or mysterious, let's say, in this period is Giorgione, who comes from the town of Castelfranco on the mainland, not far from Venice. He is so influential, but very, very few works of his survive. About 10, 15 totally survive. I mean, he makes Vermeer, by comparison, look like Mr. Prolific. And so Giorgione, there are very few of them. And he was really the first to have really to break the strong contours, the sense of disegno or line in paintings, and instead wanted to go for sort of softer effects. And he was also fascinated by the ideas of painting atmosphere, right? You can look at this picture and you can kind of see in this nativity the sort of haze or the feeling of dampness in the atmosphere, just like you're in, near Venice on this sort of coastal plain. And Giorgione is one of the first painters to paint almost exclusively on canvas, and that's also something so interesting because today in this building people are doing not paintings on wooden panel parts of polyptychs, but they're doing on the whole independent oil on canvas pictures in the revolution really that Giorgione started. So this is in the National Gallery in Washington. Went to talk to the curator, and he listened to my whole presentation. I had a binder with every single painting that I thought I wanted in the show, and he said, Frederick, you've got an interesting idea here, but he said, there's so few Giorgiones, and I know why you want one, but there's so few, you're going to spend all your time trying to make sure you get that one Giorgione in your show. He said, you don't really need it as your introduction. For the same amount of effort, you can borrow 5 Veroneses. It's like, And I said, but I love this kind of material. We don't have a painting like this in Boston. And he said, no. But he said, this early moment, the moment around 1500, has been done before in other exhibitions. What hasn't been done well is the second half of the 16th century, when you get late Titian, and then Tintoretto and Veronese are hitting their stride. And I realized, in fact, I was a bit humiliated, but his point was right, though. So many big exhibitions are like me when I visited the Matisse show. They run out of steam at the end. And if you start and have a whole lot of art around 1500, by the time you get to 1560, well, you've run out of time, you can't get the loans, and so that section gets curtailed. And truly, Tintoretto and Veronese, the two giants of the second half of the 16th century, have never been really shown well in a group show. Emphasis has always been on the first part. So I gave up on Giorgione and decided to have a curtailed introduction. Now, where would I get my early Titians? I went to Indianapolis, and this was once a beautiful painting. It's probably the poet Arielstow, and you can see it's got this beautiful velvet fabric here and the fur, the sort of taking advantage of the weave of the canvas that Giorgione and young Titian were among the first to do. But the painting's not well known. It's Indianapolis. It's not here in New York or Washington. And so I thought this could be good, except it doesn't show Titian at his best because it is just so damaged. The beard here, for example, it blends completely into the hair. This would have been distinct. This beginning of the sleeves, the painting is, all the colors have sunk. It was over-restored at least once. That is, some sort of solvent to clean the varnish managed to take off the top whole layer of the paint. And so, sorry, Indianapolis, wasn't going to do it. So I had to find my early Titian, one that would show how revolutionary his art was. I was very moved by this one, maybe you know, in the Doria Pamphili in Rome. Extremely beautiful painting of Salome here, holding the head of John the Baptist. That's probably, in fact, a self-portrait of Titian. And there's this kind of dreamy aspect, which Titian really learns from Giorgione, but also a kind of a new sense of beauty involving ancient Greek and Roman prototypes. Wonderful painting. And they said, the Doria Pamphili, I wrote to them, they said they had a loan fee of 20,000 euros. So I thought, okay. So my boss at the time said, well, Frederick, just find a great early Titian that doesn't have a loan fee. So I did, which was this, which is even more interesting because it's bigger and makes a lot of points. This is from a country house museum, the Fondazione Magnani Rocca, outside of Parma. And it's half of a sacred conversation. You've got St. Catherine here, Christ, and the Virgin Mary. Now, this is not great condition. You can see here the modeling on her neck. That was kind of lost in a restoration. Same with part of the kid's head. But other parts, the fabrics are so beautiful. And the flesh and the hair on St. Catherine is just so lovely. And then you have this very handsome Dominican, or maybe St. Dominic, who's presenting the patron. That's the guy that paid for the picture. And in the foreground, you can actually see, rosemary and parsley and mint. They're all right there. It's got amazing still life in the foreground, beautiful landscape with a hazy Giorgione background. So this one painting was pushing all the buttons I needed. And I thought, okay, this is great. And they agreed to lend this. And then I also found, about the same time, a picture in storage at the Met. And one of the points, of course, if you're dealing with names that are well-known, like Titian or Tintoretto, Veronese, you need some novità. You need something novel. You need some novelty, something that will raise some eyebrows, or like, get even the well-seasoned visitor to say, I don't think I've ever seen this. This picture had been in storage in the Met since the early 70s and was cleaned and restored in about 2004 or 5. And it's, in some ways, it's a kind of awkward picture, right? No, like, what is St. Peter doing looking out to the side? They're not really relating to each other. And in some ways, it's very grand. The seated Madonna here in the middle with a cloth of honor behind. And it's a kind of picture called a sacred conversation, a sacra conversazione, with the point being that the various saints here represented, Catherine, maybe Mary Magdalene there, or Lucy, John the Baptist, are the same name saints of whoever paid for the picture. That is, it's the person and his, his brother and his children or his wife. And so it's the kind of odd assemblage comes because it was pieced together, in effect, from other paintings. These were just kind of quotations, kind of photoshopped or, photo montaged in. And of course, not done by Bellini himself. There's a certain, the kind of sense of discontinuity comes because it was largely painted by members of the workshop. Now, what's interesting about that, you can take that as a negative, and I kind of do. It's not a particularly successful painting. But what's fascinating is, by the way I date this, thinking about what that this is based on a painting in 1506. This is one from a few years earlier. But based on the quotations, I think this has to have been done around 1505 or 6, because it seems to quote things from just a couple years earlier. And based on that, that was when young Titian is in Giovanni Bellini's workshop, which is what produced this. So I'm not saying that Titian could have painted this, but this would have been the artist's starting point, okay? And so he would have been trained as a man in his teens to do these kinds of pictures. And also important for me is it's a painting that's oil on wooden panel. And that's how you learned. In the late 15th, early 16th century, you learned on painting on wooden panel, and a panel painting is like a beautiful dining room table. It's a very smooth surface, a lot of gloss to it, and it affords a lot of detail. Canvas, though, as you know, canvas has a give and canvas has a weave, a texture. That's very different. You paint on something completely smooth and paint on something with a texture. And people had used canvas for a while, but when you particularly used canvas in the 15th and 14th centuries, when you wanted a lightweight work of art, like a banner to carry around in religious processions, too heavy to carry a big piece of wood or a plank, but you could carry something on canvas. But it was right around 1500 when you had oil, which is, as you know, a medium very different from egg tempera. You can do all sorts of things like flesh and light and glazes and reflections and mixing, and the long drying properties mean you can get expressive possibilities totally different from egg tempera. But so painting on oil had existed at least particularly in the last quarter of the 15th century. And painting on canvas had existed in selected moments in the later 15th century. But the first time that they got married together and used consistently is in Venice around 1500. So this is this is a later painting in this old technique. And then the Magnani Rocco one, the Titian here, is in this new technique. So oil on panel, oil on canvas. And in a way, it's a fantastic comparison because you've got the blue spiky mountains in the back and clouds, and you've got the seated Virgin with a full-length Christ. You've got a St. Catherine and a St. Catherine. So I was able to isolate enough of these variables that you could really see the difference. And what a transformation, because as I say, this is around 1506 or 7, and this painting is about 1511. So 4 years apart, but a world of difference. So that was a comparison I made early on, and that was my way of, basically, that whole first room I wanted with Giorgione and Vivarini, all those people disappeared, and I was able to put it down in this. Now, the point I was saying about this triumph of this new technique, this new combination of oil on canvas, becomes more apparent if you look at details. This is a Veronese from Budapest in a later section of the show, but you can see here that he is using a herringbone canvas. And Veronese was fascinated by really strong weaves, and also see what he's doing. These are learning from Giorgione and Titian, who are considerably older, but Veronese in this portrait is using the properties of the texture of the canvas and using the actual viscosity or tackiness of oil paint to do something that hadn't been done before. Oil paint in the 15th century, as you know, think of Jan van Eyck, the early Netherlandish painters, went for an enamel-like surface, really clean and smooth and sharp and bright. If you have a drier brush and drag it across your canvas, you get a broken line. And it means you can do things like hair, or particularly fur, like that. Amazing, with an amazing shortcut. And so Veronese is really playing up the texture of the herringbone, and probably even intending it to be somewhat visible, right? You always have to wonder, has a painting been damaged over time? Has the surface become thinned? But I think he was intending to do that right from the start, to have a distinction between a painting you view up close or one you view from a distance. And you stand back a few feet, everything blends together, and you get this amazing sense of the flesh and the fur. Impossible to do to the same illusionistic extent with panel painting. You can do it here with oil on canvas. Or then look at the rival Tintoretto, a painting here in Boston, using quick, small strokes here to make highlights. You don't spend weeks or even days doing this. You do this in a few minutes. It's a type of economy. Using highlights, you don't build up many layers so much, if you're Tintoretto at least, is that you often start with a medium ground, not a white ground, but a medium ground, so you can paint darks and lights right on it. So that's the Virgin Mary, and this is a detail of another figure. I mean, it could not be any simpler, right? You don't need to give much information to show a foreshortened hand. He's a nice pentimento, a change. The thumb was over, and then he moves the thumb in a bit. You can see this beautiful purpley blue. It's lapis, ultramarine blue, so that's an expensive material, but very quick strokes to set up, and you can see the kind of grayish, bit of the grayish ground, and a lot of white lead. I mean, this has its vibrancy because using lots of white mixed with the lapis paint. So as I was thinking about my exhibition comparisons, I had a couple comparisons came to mind quickly, juxtapositions that would be interesting. This is the same guy, same sitter, painted by two different people. This here is by it's Daniele Barbaro who commissions the famous villa by Palladio, the Villa Barbaro at Mazere, then frescoed later by Veronese. And this is showing Titian, and then as an older man, very accomplished with his books, etc., by Veronese. And that's a great comparison because it's the same person painted by two different portrait painters, Titian on the right, Veronese on the left. The problem is the one on the left was owned by the Rijksmuseum, and they knew that they would need to have that on view when they finally opened up after their 10 or 15-year renovation. So it was too much of a moving target. And also, this one here, it's a nice enough portrait. It's not nearly as splendid, as fancy as the Veronese. And it's owned by the Prado. So Rijksmuseum on the left, Prado on the right. The Prado painting, I believed, crossing my fingers, that I could borrow 3 pictures from the Prado. Because of the difficulty of getting Titians, I thought I wanted 3 Titians, and I did not want to use one of my 3 on something like this. I wanted a painting that had more emotive content, that was more exciting than this. So this is the kind of comparison you can make in the book, I decided, but not in the show. This is an early Tintoretto. It's National Gallery of Washington. It's the the conversion of Paul. There's Paul down there. He's finally, seen the light. He's been thrown from his horse, and it's around 1542 or 3. So, 5 or so years before that big miracle of the slave that I showed you a few minutes ago. But it's Tintoretto finding his way. The overall composition's based a bit on Raphael, but it has a tapestry-like effect, right? You can see the way he's picked out the same yellows and blues across this. So it's very kind of busy, it's exciting, it's full of energy, but it's not quite there. Washington, though, was happy to lend it because it's an important early Tintoretto. Then, though, through the help of colleagues, I was able to borrow a much better Tintoretto from several years later, owned by Queen Elizabeth. And this is Esther Before Us, and it's a remarkable painting. It's about as big as you see on the screen, maybe a little bigger. And this, though, is in the same year or so span as The Miracle of the Slave. And it's got similar figures, foreshortened arms coming out. You've got this amazing turban here and this kind of fur skirt that he's wearing. And as Esther has, she gets up her courage to to tell her husband, the king, about Haman's plot, she faints, and now all these people lean in a kind of excited manner, and there's a big burly figures out of Michelangelo. I mean, it's a fantastic painting. So when I was able to borrow this from the Royal Collection, I knew that I could then get something better from Washington. So you kind of work your way up that way. And then this was fascinating when I realized also, I wish I could tell you I had all this in my head when I started. No, it took a long time to put this together. This is a Veronese, and it's in the National Gallery, London. And it's interestingly about a mile apart from the Tintoretto. They were painted within a year of each other, but as far as I could tell, they'd never been brought together. And not only is that interesting, but they're the same painting, right? So if you go back, so we've got, most important guy is standing at left. We have a slumped woman in the middle, people leaning over with concern, and then architecture in the background. But look how different they are, right? You got the same ingredients, but where the Tintoretto one's big and burly, and it's earth tones and dark colors, and actually the architecture is not taken seriously. It's just a screen of columns in the back. Look how different these are all pastels. The people are thinner in their body type. They are trying not to touch each other. It's like, people riding the number 6 train. And the architecture is very specific, including, look at this, with the beautiful flutes of the columns. They've been chipped a bit. So Veronese has really thought of this space, but it's a very similar composition, but a totally different point. And you can see early on in both their careers, the directions that their art would take them in terms of palette, body type, gesture, etc. But it's also interesting, as I said, these are about a year apart, say both around 1547 or so. The Tintoretto painting was done by a 30-year-old. That's an impressive painting for a 30-year-old. But this is a truly outstanding and amazing painting to be painted by a 20-year-old, right? And so that I realized that, Veronese, still in Verona, town he gets his name from. He's still in Verona when he's painting things like this. But you knew that Tintoretto was not happy to hear about someone who could do something like this, who was a decade younger. Now, certain things in doing a big exhibition fall into your lap. And these are a group of very important works of ancient Greek and Roman art, including a Sabina, beautiful, full-size marble statue, very important pots, and these were works of art acquired by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, they had almost no provenance or history of ownership to speak of. Private collection, Zurich, 1975. What does that mean, right? Does that mean dug out of the ground in Sicily in 1974? Maybe, but there were things like this that a group, and the MFA actually decided, and complete to my director's credit, he sort of preemptively and proactively contacted the Italian government and said, this is a group of works, about a dozen, that we are not necessarily the rightful owners of, that we know nothing about them before, that we bought them on the international art market in the 70s or 80s. We don't think we have good title to them, and not admitting necessarily that these were illegally excavated or illegally exported, just saying we cannot prove an ownership chain that goes back, to some English country house in the 19th century, or something that you'd say, okay, it's been out of the ground a long time, et cetera. And so we gave this group, in return for signing a memorandum of understanding for cultural collaboration between the Museum of Fine Arts and the Italian government. Then here you see the then Minister of Culture, Francesco Rutelli, in Italy, shaking the hand of my director, Malcolm Rogers, and to announce this new era. And then he's pulling off, uncovering, that's the minister pulling off a statue of Irene, goddess of peace, which was a long-term loan we had as a result of of ushering in this new era of not secrecy, but rather transparency and collaboration. Now, how it benefited me is I went in 2007. So this is October of 2006. 2007, I went to Rome, and I was at a meeting in one of the buildings of the Ministry of Fine Arts, was handed an envelope, and I was told that the director of the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence, the director of the Uffizi, wants to lend you a painting. And I thought, no, he doesn't want to lend me a painting, but being forced to lend me a painting. And one of the paintings that I could choose from was Titian's Flora here, one of the most beautiful, just perfect condition, and it shows everything about what oil paint can do on canvas in terms of conveying textures like flesh and hair and fabric, and just how different this crinkly pink velvet is to the extremely soft nightshirt there. So that now he suddenly fell into my lap, a great early mature period Titian of one of his most famous subject types, that is the belladonna, the beautiful young woman. Now, this was the picture chosen as the kind of catalog picture, Venus at the Mirror by Titian, National Gallery of Art in Washington. The three artists, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese. Titian is born 30 years before Tintoretto and 40 years before Veronese. But because Titian has a very long life, he lives and paints until he's about 88, it means these three artists overlap for about 4 decades of activity. They're all in the same place. They all travel a bit, but most importantly, they stay in Venice. And I think one reason they stay in Venice is because they realize that this kind of competition kept them on their toes. So then that's the subtitle, Rivals in Renaissance Venice. Really, for the first time, to think about how one artist might try to outdo another, to make reference to something, to indicate your debt to another artist by using a composition or borrowing a figure or a palette or a composition, but then changing enough to distance yourself from that artist and prove your superiority over the other one. Now, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, now we had a very long run, right? Typically, big exhibitions, a Blockbuster, 3 months. So this was 5 months, so much longer run. And the reason for that is because our partner became the Louvre. Now, we went to the Louvre to borrow a Titian and a Tintoretto, and they said, oh, would you like to partner with us? Now, and that was that's very flattering. I mean, in a sense, I married up, right? To go from Boston to Paris. But of course, being French, they wanted to do their own show, and with their own, they had a completely different catalog and different installation. Had the show gone from Boston to a smaller American town, I probably would have dictated everything. But so, as you know, nothing happens in France in August, right? So we could have a nice long run in Boston because they were not going to open it until September. So that was our sort of logo. And then when you got to the first wall, you had right on the entrance, a blow-up of a sort of a 17th century, 16th century, late 16th, early 17th century map of Venice. And I had this color scheme where Tintoretto would be in blue, Titian in yellow, and by the way, this is Tintoretto's studio, and that's Titian's studio, and my apartment was right there, kind of equidistant, and then Veronese is here in green. And what I tried to figure out is just with the more important public commissions, not the private commissions, but things for churches, government buildings, confraternities, that is kind of religious clubs, you often had a building where one or two were. And the other thing you realize, these artists covered, like graffiti artists, they covered the walls of their city, and you could not have been someone attentive to art, that is a patron or someone who observed art, nor could you have been Titian, Tintoretto, or Veronese and walked or taken a boat anywhere in town without being immediately reminded of one painting after another by these three guys, right? So it was an intense context. And because the artists spend their whole careers in Venice, they were always learning it from each other and rivaling each other. So this is the lighting is very different from the show. I want it to be, again, like the beginning of an opera or a movie where you lower the lights. And the first room was quite a bit darker. That was that first comparison, the moving from panel to canvas. And then this is an example of an early painting in the kind of Bellini circle of Christ carrying the cross. And then so on panel and very tight. This is a more or less Titian starting point. Here is a late Titian of Christ carrying the cross on canvas. And the arc, how you get from this to this, is also, in a sense, Titian's great contribution. And that's that enormous Esther Nazareus by Tintoretto, owned by Queen Elizabeth. Now, a fascinating painting was done around 1545 or so by Tintaretto, and this is the Contest of Apollo and Marsyas, and it was done for Pietro Aretino. Aretino is a famous writer in the 16th century, buddy of Titian, but also a kind of PR person for Titian, and would write lots of letters and publish these letters. He's the first guy, in fact, to publish his letters. He sent, editions of his letters, private letters that were read for their wittiness. In a sense, he was like the first blogger. And Aretino was such a good PR person for Titian that Tintoretto wanted in on this too. And Tintoretto wanted in on this, and he paints this picture for Aretino. And this indeed may be Aretino here coming to judge the contest, of the musical contest. And Tintoretto probably gave this to him for free. Now, this was a ceiling painting, and this is another important thing about expectations of formats. Rectangular paintings tend to go on walls, but other shaped paintings, circular, elliptical, octagonal, those paintings in Renaissance Venice went on ceilings. And this picture, owned by the Hartford Wadsworth Athenaeum, has never really appealed to me so much, even though it was done for this famous critic and writer as a kind of attempt for Tintoretto to get in on this guy, who was Titian's buddy and promoter. But it's so roughly painted, it just didn't seem to work as a wall painting. But as a ceiling painting, it made so much more sense. But it's been on the wall for hundreds of years, probably 2 or 3 centuries. And I thought maybe I could put it back on the ceiling. So I asked the conservator, that is the restorer in charge of the collection's condition in Hartford, would you consider putting it back on a ceiling? He said, well, yes, in fact, it's in good condition. And the other thing that was funny about, and it could withstand that. The other thing is, you can see here, they at some point these things have been painted a gray. They were never meant to be visible and were really awkward. Now, this is not my show. This was the Prado, Museo del Prado exhibition in Madrid in 2007, a big retrospective on Tintoretto. And they'll keep the color blue in mind because it's a beautiful color, and of course I stole that. But this was that early Tintoretto I decided not to borrow because I could get one that made a better statement, and also as a better Tintoretto, but also a better pair with a similar Veronese in composition. But then this here you can see this really important picture, but just how awful it looks, those corners. It just doesn't make any sense. So I thought to myself, okay, let's put on the ceiling and let's also modify the frame. They agreed to that, and our frame guy painted and then made out of wood these spandrels to cover the corners, right? And just gilded them and then did these kind of simple illusionistic rosettes. And then you see the painting, how improved it is, even in the bad lighting of our storeroom, by making the corners there, suddenly the composition comes together better. All these gentle curves like the bow and the back of this figure now are echoed by the shape of the canvas in this matting, which you did not have before. And then you can see we're putting it up in the ceiling. They're drilling it up. This was in a newspaper. And then you see the picture there back on the ceiling. And then, ta-da, looking straight up. We recreated a Venetian ceiling. And it worked extremely well, particularly because the housing around it in terms of the framing was better, but also you couldn't get right up to it, and as a decoration of the building, it had a different level of finish, right? It was expected to be part of the decoration of a room and not suffer the kind of scrutiny you would have with a wall painting. So very happy about that, and it makes the case much better than it had been made for centuries. Now, another question, of course, is what do you do with, Hartford to Boston, right? There's a kind of regional sense. New England museums help each other out. What do you do about Modena, though, right? This town, famous for Ferrari and Luciano Pavarotti and also balsamic vinegar, but they have this. They've got some very good Venetian paintings. And I remember talking to Everett Fahey, who was the chairman of European painting at the Met then, and I said, do you know anybody in Modena? He says, no, the last superintendent retired, and then the new person I haven't met yet. And so I was wondering, how am I going to get a painting out of Modena? Because they don't ever want to borrow from us, and it's not a museum that tends to do big exhibitions. Well, again, being extremely lucky, Modena put on an exhibition of Dutch painting of the Golden Age of the 17th century, and they borrowed from the National Gallery in London this woman at keyboard instrument, and this is a Vermeer, and the Vermeer was the star of this picture, of the show. And in the background is this raucous scene, right? And that painting, in fact, was owned by Vermeer's family, and Vermeer knew it. And so he puts it in the picture, and well, guess who by chance happens to own this painting by Dirk van Beveren, a Caravaggius painting? Well, Museum of Fine Arts Boston. And so that's our painting. And they needed it for their show. And so then I could write and say, well, we're happy to lend. This is the first time there's been a Dutch exhibition in this part of Italy. We'd like to be part of it, but may I propose a loan exchange? And so we're able to get the great Veronese of St. Menna there. That's the Veronese, and that's the Tintoretto. And I love this. It was a comparison of sort of knights in armor, reflective surfaces, and it's a great one because this Tintoretto here, Veronese, this is part of an organ shutter, that it was the sort of doors, big canvas doors you'd have in Renaissance Venice to cover up the pipes of an organ when you're not playing the instrument. And I believe that Veronese made it emphasize the niche aspect and the sculptural aspect, the figure coming out, and the rounded arch, because he was trying to outdo Tintoretto's overly boisterous painting. And you see, both artists are showing off their ability to paint shiny metal. So thank you, Modena. Now, Last Suppers are a great topic, obviously. The Venetian painters are famous for their feast scenes, these biblical feasts with lots of characters, and they tend to have, particularly in the hands of Veronese, a rather secular cast. It doesn't seem like a religious event so much as just a really big party. But Last Suppers have too many characters. The paintings are too big. And so we went with something else, the Supper at Emmaus. The Supper at Emmaus is the moment when, after the crucifixion, there are two disciples who are walking to the town of Emmaus, and they're very sad because their leader, Christ, had been killed, and they are disconsolate. And as they walk, they're suddenly approached, find themselves right next to a man who talks with them, and he seems to know a lot about the events of the past few days. And they're kind of mystified how he was so familiar, and they can't put their finger on it. When they get to the town of Emmaus, they ask their stranger to sit with them and eat, and he accepts their invitation. And in that moment, he takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it in two, which of course is the events of the Last Supper. And they realize immediately, as he throws out his hand right here, that this, in fact, is Christ himself. And so the Supper at Emmaus is a recreation of the Last Supper. Because it has fewer characters, you can fit it in a smaller format. And this is a beautiful Titian from the Louvre with, you have to take my word for it, Titian actually painted all the weave of, not the canvas, but of this tablecloth, as if it's been folded and ironed, and so you can see it back and forth, and the effects of the fabric itself and then the folds is just extraordinary. The still life is amazing. You think of Murano glass, right? Or the Carlo Scarpa exhibition at the Met with these beautiful vessels here and wonderful fabrics, and then again, the kind of characteristic mountains in the background. So this is Titian around 1530. This is the kind of baseline of the high Renaissance, harmonious composition. Look what Tintoretto does. Same subject, and you can know he's referencing this because look at the column right behind the head. It's very clear. The guy in green at the left, the kind of hat on the page. Tintoretto is really making clear that he understands what Titian is doing. But with this being calm, instead these figures are sweeping out, right? It's centrifugal force. They're bursting out from the center. You've got these strong diagonals of these walking stick, so it's just bursting with energy. It's a totally different kind of picture where Titian is calm and rational. Tintoretto's is just bursting with energy and really almost haphazard. And then you compare the sort of, if that's, thesis, antithesis, synthesis would be Veronese, and this is a later picture where he's got his, you've got the energy of the Tintoretto, but it's now inward focused, not outward focused, and the palette, right, which all these earth tones here, is now replaced with the pastels, so characteristic of Veronese. I mean, he really specialized in sort of lemon yellow and lime green and salmon pink. And again, the columns in the back and then sort of Christ in the middle, and the green here with the arm extended. You can see all variations of the same figure. They're really working at this. And in fact, even the innkeeper with the tight hat there is a variant on that. I mean, the whole thing is quite something. And in fact, that color and that color are so similar. So these artists are not just looking at each other, they're trying to learn from each other and outdo each other. So this is my feast group. Another quick story. This is a very important picture by Tintoretto from around 1560. It was in storage at Accademia for quite some time, Accademia in Venice. And when I was part of the team in the 2007 exhibition at the Prado, the big Tintoretto retrospective, the director of the Prado and the curator, my colleague, went to Venice to borrow this. And the director of the Accademia, she said, "Oh, we'd like to lend this one. It's not seen by anybody now, but it's not in good condition. It's too fragile to travel. It needs restoration. We don't have any money." And when I heard that, I was thinking, if there's a problem you can solve with money, it's not a problem, right? And as Pamela explained, I'm very involved with Save Venice. And so then I went back just a year later after the Prado show and said, even 6 months after the Prado show, I said, I would like to display this picture, this Tintoretto that's not known. I've got theories about it, and I can find the money for the restoration through Save Venice. And she said that would be wonderful, because in a way this would be unlocking a picture that's kind of stuck in storage to bring it out. Because if you restore it for Boston, then it can go on the walls in Venice as well. So that's pre-restoration, and there you see after restoration. Incredible improvement, and it emerges as a huge picture of powerful Michelangelesque figures. And this, in fact, is the room that I put together a bit like a church where we had open lighting to the sky. So these were skylights, and you're alternating the two paintings in armor on the far left, but Tintoretto, Veronese, Tintoretto, Veronese, Tintoretto, and you could set them up as if they're altars in a kind of church, with this one that I just restored as the high altarpiece. Then you move in, this was the kind of the very sexy room, the room of the Venuses, and so I admit what I did. I first lowered the height of all the pictures so they're much more intimate. You're kind of looking right at them, kind of level of a bed, you might say. The walls are red. And I put these curtains, replicating the curtains inside these pictures, and the room was quite extraordinary. Titian's Danae from Naples, the Venus with a musician, organist from the Prado, very beautiful and not that well-known Titian of Venus and Adonis from the Getty, and then from here in New York, the extremely beautiful Venus and Mars by Veronese. So 3 Titians and a Veronese, just one part of the group. And it was fun to watch people walk in and go, oh, and they sort of, because it was quite remarkable, and so much lovely flesh in one room. The great Danae, of course, where Danae had been locked by her father in a tower, right? And she's visited by Zeus in the form of a cloud of gold. And this painting is just remarkable. I mean, it was so sexy that while it was still being painted, it said that it made another Titian nude figure, that is the Venus of Urbino, now at the Uffizi. But in comparison, this one made that one look like a nun. So, and you can see that her face is flushed, her legs are parted, her hands are touching, kind of grasping at the bed linens. I mean, it's quite something. And Cupid kind of gets out of the way. His feet almost get trapped in this thick bed, bed covers there, velvet. And she looks up at this amazing cloud of Venetian ducats, the Venetian coins that come down. I mean, it's an amazing painting. To borrow that from Naples, the Capo di Monte Museum, we had to send them a great Van Gogh, a great Manet, and a great Degas. So I think it was worthwhile for both sides. And then this was the wonderful painting of Venus with the mirror. This is a mid-period Titian, so it's a few years after that. You can see she's kind of covering herself up because she looks in the mirror and then, of course, spies us, and she realizes that she's being watched. But I don't think she's bothered. I think she actually kind of likes the attention. And there you see up close, she's being crowned by Cupid, and she looks out at us. And I was going to compare this with a painting by Veronese. It's just been actually given in the last few months to the Worcester Museum of Art, but it was owned by someone in New York. And I used to have indoor and outdoor Venuses, right? That Titian clearly in a bedroom, this in a garden. But my co-curators at the Louvre had a very good idea and said, yes, that's okay, indoor, outdoor Venuses, but why don't you skip Venus and make it beautiful women and mirrors? Because you first have the Titian, and then you can have this one, a little awkward. I don't know how you could hold that pose very comfortably. But this is a Veronese in Omaha, of all places. But you can see it's Veronese trying to outdo the Titian, because whereas Titian shows the body facing you, this is not got her back to you with this amazing serpentine mannerist pose, and she's looking at the mirror at us. So it's trying, very ambitious kind of picture. So Omaha said they would lend that to us, and though the painting had a very fragile frame, so I'll get that in a second. But this is the Tintoretto, the third of our beautiful women in mirrors. This is by far Tintoretto's most beautiful female nude. It's Suzanne and the Elders. She is so sort of preoccupied with her own image. She finds it so beautiful. She doesn't notice these guys who are kind of creeping up on her. But you can see it's not just about vanity, but also about reflections. You've got reflections in the water, reflections in the mirror. It's about observing and being observed. A fascinating painting. The three of those had a kind of wonderful dialogue. Here you see the Omaha Veronese. Funny thing is, on the flight to Omaha, I was wearing a suit, and they said, "Oh, are you here to see Mr. Buffett?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to see Warren Buffett. It was actually I'm going to the art museum." And normally you say you're an appointment with the art museum, you impress people, but in Omaha, you really should be having your appointment with Mr. Buffett. But now we had to make the frame was very fragile, so we made a new frame for it. And this is a kind of fun thing, because the same man in our building who did the spandrels of the ceiling painting, he made this frame, and he said, well, let's make it black, taking the cues from the black frame around the mirror inside the picture. And it was like so simple, but it worked so well. Again, a big curtain. There's the real curtain there. But it's so clearly in dialogue with the Titian I just showed you, because you've got the fur against the skin and the reflection and the idea of being kind of captured in an intimate moment inside your bedroom. Now, this picture is not from my show. This is from the Victoria and Albert Museum on the Renaissance at Home, 2006. And it was all about the types of rooms people lived in the Renaissance, the things that they decorated their homes with, the difference between public rooms and private rooms. And this is a mother-daughter, father-son pair by Veronese, so early in his career when he's still on the mainland, or mostly on the mainland, and it's very beautiful pictures. They were meant to be a pair, and they don't look like a pair because, of course, they're framed totally different, right? And so this is in Baltimore at the Walters, and this is in the Florence in the Uffizi. And not only are they framed differently, they're way too low. These were for giant rooms, the piano nobile of the upper floors of a big palazzo, and they would have been pretty high off the ground. So this did them no favors. And then, this drove me nuts, they found a sword almost exactly like the sword of Giuseppe da Porto, but they put the sword in front of the painting, as if the painting is the footnote to the sword and not the other way around. And when I saw this, I thought, I made a little vow. If I can ever bring these two back together, I want to make them look like a pair and give them the dignity that they deserve. So, of course, out goes the sword. And I was able to get, based on a photograph of this, able to convince the Baltimore Museum, the Walters, could we ship them a new frame that matches this so the two look like a pair? And they agreed. And you'll see the difference in presentation. This does not look like a matched pair. They're also far too close, right? I mean, the point is the two sets of eyes are supposed to, he's supposed to be looking at us, and we're supposed to look at her as a kind of triangle. They're too close. And she cannot be looking at him, her husband. And this little boy is supposed to be looking at his sister, but they're just too close. And you can see when they're framed similarly, and it now makes sort of a coherent statement. And the distance, he's looking at his sister, she looks out, she looks at him, it all works. And there you see on the wall, it was so much more coherent than the previous display. So one lesson in this is you learn a lot by the mistakes or sometimes the shortcomings, not intentional, of other exhibitions. This was my portrait room. I love this with the three gentlemen of fashion, these guys in these fur coats, then these warriors here, and then Titian modeling, coming up with a formula, and Tintoretto then continuing that. The last room was devoted to late styles. So the show had a kind of chronological beginning and ending, but it was thematic otherwise, and the sort of examples of women in peril. And it's fascinating that at the end of these three artists' lives, they turned to subjects from classical mythology literature of high emotion and often high violence. Same artist that painted kind of languid nudes and beautiful kind of distant landscapes had these subjects of great violence. Painting from Bordeaux in France of Tarquin and Lucretia by Titian, a certain amount of workshop assistance, but a very powerful painting and many beautiful sections to it. Quite something. So that's a aggressive Titian, and you can see, though, compared to Titian, Tintoretto's even more energetic, right? Because we've got the toppling the bedpost over here, and these are all, see these little dots? These are her pearl necklace, right? So, which has been broken from her neck, and the pearls are now falling in midair. Kind of amazing thing, and the bodies are spinning around, and the very shiny, satiny bed covers are sort of spread everywhere. And so the energy here is even compounded as the figures move around. So Tarquin, Lucretia, Tarquin, and Lucretia here. Titian on the right, Tintoretto on the left, and then this huge painting, even bigger, painted by Veronese. It's Perseus and Andromeda. And the nice connection in terms of genealogy is that Perseus, who was rescuing Andromeda, Perseus is the son of Danae and Zeus, right? The shower of gold, so comes in there. And these are, so it's wonderful. But also look at her pose. It's very similar to her pose there. And not sure which one was done first, but I'm sure one of the artists was doing it as a response to the other. And then you see, this is, remember the Prado blue, right? Just borrowed that. It works very well for these late paintings. And so Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese doing this set of pictures. The crate that this picture, the big Veronese came in, is as large as my apartment. I mean, it's just huge. Now, what I'm very proud of was the review in the New York Times. Holland Carter actually said, "No filler here, not an ounce of fat." And that made me very pleased because everything in there, at least to him, seemed to be justified. That every comparison made sense. I wasn't indulging just because I could borrow more paintings or had them already in the building, putting them on the wall. And I was able to make my points pretty concisely and cleanly. In fact, I would like this on my tombstone. And what I realized, though, is that as I was doing this process, that I was really writing a set of three interconnected biographies, okay? I was looking at three artists, sort of concise biographies, but putting them together. And also I was realizing that I was doing fundamentally a human story, one about passion and insecurity and confidence and response, emulation and rivalry. And by the last section, it was gratifying because many visitors told me that they didn't need the labels. The labels saying what the artist was kind of superfluous, because by then you could tell at the last room of the show that, muscular figure, Michelangelo's pose must be Tintoretto. Softer brushwork, broken contours, misty backgrounds must be Titian. And this is fabulous. So this is from the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna, the Tintoretto. Titian, look at this, the big, strong strokes of the Tintoretto, soft, gauzy layers with the Titian. There's amazing things, including a vein that goes down the arm here, and the sinews of the neck is just wonderful. Fascinating. Also, I've got together three St. Jeromes, and each artist painted Jerome as his own age at the time, right? So you've got a still pretty vigorous Tintoretto, a much older Titian, and he's holding onto the Bible in a way, kind of as a banister. It's an extremely moving painting. And then you compare that with Veronese, the most suave, the prettiest pink here, and just extremely elegant pastel colors, and real sense of kind of clarity in the landscape compared to Titian, who wanted this kind of very moving and misty kind of storm. And so each artist's personality was so striking that most visitors could figure out who was who by the last room based on what they had learned this far. So after these images of three St. Jeromes, three old men, the only way to end it was with this. And this is a late Tintoretto self-portrait. It was painted around 1588 because there's a print, an engraving that was done right in that year, and I bet this painting, the self-portrait by Tintoretto, was done immediately before the engraving, and that's dated 1588. And what you think about 1588 is an important date because it's a dozen years after Titian dies. He dies in 1576, but it's also the year that Veronese dies. And I think you can explain this expression. Remember, artists tend not to do self-portraits for others, they do them for themselves. It's marking a moment, it's taking stock. It's with a mirror or two, it's the most available, most handy model, but you're taking stock, and I think you can justify this expression. His eyes are kind of hollow, there's this kind of sense of the wind passing over. He looks even a bit bewildered. I think the point is not that at this moment Tintoretto felt triumphant or felt that he had vanquished everyone else, but rather instead he took a pause, he looked around, and he realized that he was the last one standing, and the great rivalry that had spurred him on had now ended. Thank you.